Right, so it looks like, from the way it's clouding over, like we're about to have a pretty rainy Saturday. So I think it's probably a good idea to try and get the review done promptly. So let's see if I can remember where I've planted 41 different sets of trees. So first up is our macadamia, who is kind of stagnating. There's a little bit more improvement in the growing points. Leaves look healthy, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just not doing much yet. So another one that's not doing much yet, but that's not unexpected because you know, succulents aren't known for their speed of growth generally. The aloedendron barberry, the eastern tree aloe, is that some new growth maybe? I'm not sure, but it's a little bit mud splattered, but otherwise healthy. The peperomias are starting to point in the right direction, so hopefully that's promising, and hopefully these will fill out a bit and cover the bare soil before the end of the rains. So our little tree hibiscus, the Thespesia, is definitely showing some nice new growth in there, which is good. And the soursop, Annona muricata, I think, yeah, there's a continuation of the new growth. I don't know whether there's anything new since last week, but it's still healthy, still functional, and the tree generally looks pretty perky. Even its side plants are starting to look a little bit more like they're actually in the ground rather than just freshly plopped. A lovely little bay laurel, Laurus nobilis, is definitely showing some nice little bits of new growth, unhampered by the fact that I have already used a couple of leaves from this one to take the pressure off the two existing bushes. Bauhinia petersiana, the handkerchief tree, or one of the wild Bauhinias rather. It's showing some lovely new growth. Leaves generally pretty perky. New growth popping up in a few places. I will eventually have to prune this one as they are inclined to be more scrambling if you don't. So because I do want it to be a tree, it will eventually need pruning, but it's really nice to see some new growth coming up. And hopefully it'll start going in multiple directions. Okay, now below this very vigorous flowering aloe, which as far as I can tell Neriensis is probably the best bet, but there's a couple of the other ones in the same tetraploid group of East African ones that also have a fairly short pedestal and medium length perianth. So I'll get back to you on that. So still CF for now. But next to that, our little Washingtonia does actually look like it's done a little bit of growing. I do need to trim back some of these grasses coming up around it because they'll swallow the calincos otherwise. But yeah, that does look like a little bit of new growth poking up there, so I'm pleased with that. See the fairly different structure on the flowers of the Aloe Cameroni, even though it's a broadly similar aloe. Not too closely related, but fairly different structure as the flowers come up. Aha! We have progress. Some new growth coming on one of my waterberries, so good. I think we will hopefully be able to manage at least one survivor here, which is what we've counted, so that is good. Anything on this side? No. On this side there's nothing showing new growth. On to Rolf the Rolfia, who is, yeah, still pretty perky. A couple of leaves, not living their best life, but generally speaking, looking pretty decent. He's a little bit floppier in the leaf than I'd like at this stage, but he's definitely picking up from where he started. Here's Dracaena with the shelter of these guava trees behind that wall of Mexican sunflower, pretty perky, and his Aloe Neriensis also coming up nicely. Okay, so our little cashew experiment seems to be going pretty well. I mean, that is some definite new growth there. I don't think that's new growth, but it's healthy. There's a little new growth in the middle there, and some more new growth there. So our 5 cashews currently quite healthy. The Syagris suffered a little in the heavy rain, and so all the mature leaves have flopped over. I've tried spreading them out evenly so the central meristem isn't being too disturbed, and it is still healthy. That should still survive. Better than where it was originally with rats tunneling under it. But yeah, that's not how I expected this to go. 5 healthy cashews and 1 very tragic looking queen palm. The other 2 Syagrus, on the other hand, I would say are looking fairly happy. So that's got some new growth. Is that new? Yes. Some new growth down there. And this one is opening up nicely. This new leaf starting to fan out at the top. Right, now with our little kapok, which I'm hoping is Saber pentandra, sorry. This is something I should have shown you on day 1. These marvellous spines. Now this green bark is why I think it's Saber pentandra and not Bombax saber. But let's see how the plant itself is doing. It's looking reasonable. No real new growth, obviously, but no real sunburn. The Dracaenas have definitely taken the worst of the sunburn for it. Aloes and the calico still flopping about. They will perk up eventually though. The plumeria is also one that is probably actually perking up a little at this point. Those leaves are not as floppy as they were, but it's hard to say if that's just humidity or because there's some sort of connection forming with the soil. The Kigelia it went in with. We've got a growth tip, we've got a fair bit of sunburn going on here, but we do seem to have some resilience to that, and I do think this Dracaena has taken the bulk of that damage. The growth tip isn't doing much yet, but it is there, so hopefully that will come soon. Our lychees aren't looking too bad, actually. Sorry, a little skink just ran past, don't know if you caught that. Yeah, so no new growth really, but nice colour, and no real stress visible. A little bit of wrinkling on these leaves, that's probably just from manhandling them. No sign really yet that the calico's noticed it's in soil, it's still very flopped, but hopefully that will perk up. The amla, or emblic, or Indian gooseberry, looking pretty reasonable I would say, no sign of any great distress there. And the other lychee actually seems to have got a little bit greener since it went in. I think having this aloe right there has helped shelter it a little more than it already was, so hopefully that'll leave it somewhat perky. It should push past this without too much trouble. I might take off some of these leaves as it seems to be struggling at any point. Okay, now we'll be pleased to see that the heptaplurum is definitely growing up top. Leaves definitely flattening out nicely. Yeah, all in all, pretty happy. I talked last time about how Hamilton and Aitken, our 2 little Mopani trees, are ironically for a tree that cannot tolerate shade, a little bit sunburned, but the leaves that weren't burned last week seem actually fine. Not seeing anything much by way of growth. It should start just there, but it's not really happening yet. But they are notoriously slow growing, so not too concerned if they're not doing much yet. Aitken is actually looking a little bit more like she might grow, but a little bit burned on the growth. So yeah, Hamilton stagnating, Aitken doing but suffering too. So our rough lemon, as rough lemons are wont, is showing some instant growth when going in. Unfortunately at this time of year the ants are particularly active, so you can see on that new growth we've already got some sorry, I'm not sure, that's some little fadol, which will be farming aphids here pretty soon if they're not already. Yeah, they are. That will probably lead to a little bit of distortion in the growth, but generally speaking the lemons don't mind that too much. The oranges suffer a lot more from that. Our little tree philodendron, looking nice and perky. Still nowhere near big enough for me to even think about taking away the bamboo, some of which worryingly isn't looking as dead as I was hoping. This would not be a good time for its first rooting from stem cutting. But anyway, the actual focus here is looking pretty good. I might take off this leaf, which seems to have started to lie down completely and doesn't look like it's going to thrive. So maybe taking that off will stimulate a bit more growth. It looks like we might end up dividing this little guy because you can see there's a secondary growth point just in there. Sorry, my thumb hiding it. Just there. Okay, the peperomia is also growing. That might actually be a flower coming up. Yeah, so I'm happy with that. So in the daylight you can see more clearly how flopped over the Alonieriensis that went in with the tree tomato is. And just release that leaf that was getting a bit pinned by the devil's backbone. But some lovely growth coming there. I'm actually kind of hoping this is going to be the yellow fruited one. They just had red/yellow at the nursery where I got it. I think they just sort of cross-pollinate and hope for the best. Yellow is a little bit more savoury, which is generally speaking what I'd prefer. But yeah, it's obviously a healthy little plant. It was fresh from new, but no real complaints yet. Tea tree is still looking pretty vigorous. There doesn't seem to be any increase in the growth, and I'm a little concerned this doesn't seem to be darkening anytime soon. Still very soft and fragile. A little bit more new growth down below, actually. But otherwise, generally fairly happy. I'm slightly curious as to why there's no sort of progress on this new growth, but hopefully that'll harden up. I'll keep an eye on the base in case there's a drainage issue. And our first moringa is still just so happy to be here. I'm really pleased with that. The little aloe that went in it did go a little red for a while, but it's really perked right up. It'll be really interesting to work out once that flowers whether it's just a more shaded climatized Cameroni or a different one. I think it's a different one. The spacing is different, and the striping on the stems actually, I have a theory about that which I'll let you know of later. Okay, our first lychee to go in, I don't know if you recall, it had very pale whitish reddish new growth. That's greening up nicely. There's a tiny little growing tip there, but I don't know if the camera will pick it up. I might just try and ease that slightly out of its way. Aloe perky, and because it's in shade, the Dracaena is perfectly happy with its existence. The Garcinia over here has brought a little wood sorrel with it, clearly, but is looking reasonably happy about life. Some lovely new growth coming out to the sides there. I'd like a little bit more coming up the top, but you can see that lovely red colouring a lot of our native trees get on the new growth, and a fair few Asian ones do too. A little lipstick coloured bit starting to come out there, and you can see the plain-leaved penwiper has got some new growth too. You got again the same little lipstick red colouring on the side growth and nothing on the top on the second Garcinia or mangosteen. Penwiper again looking perfectly happy. Aloe somewhat flopped, but that's not that surprising. And this Dracaena a little more exposed and a lot more flopped. Our little Jackalberry, who has suffered so much, is trying to do a little bit of new growth, so that's good. Hopefully, yeah, we've got a lot coming up there. So yeah, hopefully this was a specialist, because it does seem to have left most of the growing tips intact. So probably there's a pupa somewhere nearby of a moth that will thrive on this once it's mature and hopefully pollinate it too. Our little Suriname cherry is a little sorry about being transferred. I did keep it in water for a couple of days, so it's probably just a little shocked. The drop of water, this little new growth should be a little bit firmer than that. They usually come out quite vigorous, but that'll pick up as it comes along. The leaves are a little bit short in texture. You can definitely tell this is a slightly water-stressed plant, but we've had some fairly torrential rain the last couple of days, so I'm hopeful it should pick up pretty quickly. And its companion, the bottle brush, is definitely looking pretty vigorous. Very much that pale new growth, but turning red in places, which is nice. I don't know if that's healthy yet, but hopefully it's not a problem. It's prettier, and it looks healthier to me just because of what I'm used to. A little pill bug there, I don't know if you can see that one. And a little flower just sneaking up on the aloe, but I suspect that was there and I just didn't notice in the replanting. Our wild pear, as much as it's still looking perfectly healthy, I'm a little concerned it's somewhat stagnating. There's a tiny bit more growth in there than last week, and that leaf should be new too, so hopefully that's not a problem. It still looks pretty healthy, but this main stem doesn't seem to be doing anything at all. Maybe that's just positioning, maybe it's favoring the upright stem from this position. We will see. A little Dovialis, the K-apple, Dovialis, name unpronounceable if you have Afrikaans heritage, is looking really good and vigorous. This is really nice new growth, really perky, very happy with that. Oh, and more aloe cameroni sneaking into flower. Bauhinias, both the larger one and the smallest two that went in here are growing nicely. The least exposed one has some growth, but not much, and you can see the aloe cameroni is flowering again. The second part of the Bauhinia planting, we've got some new growth, not as much as the first one, but definitely quite considerable on this formerly very sunburned large one. And where are the small ones in this one? Yeah, the backup planting, little one there. It's got some lovely new growth on it, so there should be at least one more. Yeah, there we go. And this one as well, looking very good and vigorous. So yeah, we will end up hopefully with the 2 trees counted, and then some. So for future reference, don't need to be so cautious with Bauhinias just because you damage their roots a bit. The rough lemons, looking nice still. Again, you can see some ant activity. This time it's Polyrhachis, which is one of the spiny savanna ants. It's another farmer, but it's generally a lot less aggressive about that. It doesn't tend to farm such large numbers as some of the other ants. And the plant is looking healthy, and I'm not actually seeing any masses of aphids on here, so it might just be curiosity that the ant's exploring for. The yucca in here is looking pretty firm, so that should be nicely rooted by now. The second of the little rough lemons is looking a little less perky. It's definitely lost some leaves around the top. A little bit, these formerly damaged leaves still not looking great. I would love some signs of new growth on this one actually, but for now it's not unhealthy, so I will accept that. The Dracaena, also not as perky as the yucca, but also reasonably settled. Our little tiny Brachystegia actually has, you can see the little red spot in the middle there, has some growth coming, so that is good, because otherwise this is going to be a very small tree for a very long time. Still no perking up really from its Dracaena. We'll see if that one loses its top. No great progress from the Trichilia, the Muscili, but you can see there's a growth point there, and it's a healthy enough growth point, so I'm not too worried. Ant damaged pear that were always surplus to my count because they went in with damaged roots, and this is a very root dependent tree. This one is actually looking pretty healthy, so provided it can regenerate that taproot, we might end up with 3 nice ones. The one that I had thought was the only one left for a while is almost certainly dead, but we'll see. The third one is in exactly the same state that we left it, maybe a little bit more dust splattered from the rain we've had. Our little volunteer fig that popped up from a little bit of root that were left behind is definitely showing some perkiness. I have found what was probably the source of the original seed of this fig on a roundabout not far from where a friend who gave me the potted plant that this had popped up in came from. It does seem to be a freestanding tree, non-parasitic, and it itself was heavily infested with some of our native mistletoes, which are really beautiful and fantastic for the sunbirds. So I'm hoping this will get big enough that I can start introducing some of those. Our little mango tree greened up nicely. No real new growth. There's a first suggestion that it's going to put out some more this season, just in the middle there. Tiny little lip of leaves starting to form. Moringa number 2 has definitely suffered a little more. Moringa number 1, you can see some sort of snail or slug has been up here and left a little bit of damage, nothing major. But I think the older leaves suffered a little bit in the change of lighting. So although it's got some lovely new growth coming, a lot of its older growth is best removed. One of its aloes is looking a little sunburned, but as aloe arborescens, it's an incredibly tolerant species, so it should perk back up soon enough. Winter thorn is a little bit of a mixed bag. I don't think there was anything much on this branch when we planted it. There's some new growth on this branch and down there, and a tiny bit at the tip of this branch. So provided these are the dominants, this should be the dominant, we should end up with a healthy little tree. I mean, they form wonderful shapes anyway if they lose their dominance, so it's not too much of a concern. But I would like a little bit more vigor from that, because when they're at this stage, most of their growing is rainy season. It's only when they're bigger and their roots get deeper that they start primarily growing in winter. Our most recent round of the Malina plantings. This one's lost a little bit of its perk as it's settled in, but there is definitely some health at the tip there. Bridelia number 1 is dying back, still alive down here, but this is not. So that we'll see if that's when we end up having to take off the count. Malina number 2 is showing a little bit of growth up there. Bridelia number 2 also, definitely the tip is dying, hopefully the whole plant isn't. Malina number 3 is alive, but the leaves I left on it, it has decided it's not keeping, and its secondary stem here seems like it's not long for the world. The next Bridelia has some new growth, so you know that's the first promise we've seen on the Bridelia next to the first real sulk we've seen on a Malina. The Malina after that, some new growth, so hopefully that will be looking much perkier within a week or so. And this next Bridelia is very exposed, and the top has very much died back, but there's something about these lower points really look like there's some life coming in quite vigorously in there. I'm not sure, we'll see next week hopefully some more progress on that. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more life higher in the stem than the first two. Just the tip once again is completely done for. And the last Malina from that planting, looking reasonably perky, so I'm happy with that one. Jacaranda, looking pretty perky, some nice red growth. And this little tulip tree, the Spathodia campanulata, is looking nice and vigorous, lovely furry little bit of new growth there. Vespesia, which I was convinced was going to be our first casualty, it's got a lovely little new leaf just there, which is great. So that's the tree hibiscus, which again has an edible fruit as well as a colour changing flower. And on the note of flowers, this little aloe, which I can't actually remember which type this is, in the sun the freshly planted Nyeriensis and Cameroni look similar, but I think this is Cameroni. That's coming into flower again. Next Jacaranda, not as vigorous, but definitely some new growth there, not too bad. And this is definitely an aloe Cameroni, I would say. And we've got some lovely flower coming up. Last, the Jacarandas, pretty perky. The original round of new growth it tried to produce has definitely suffered in the sun, but there's another round coming up now. And this Dracaena is standing up pretty nicely now, having been a little bit floppy. I still haven't added more soil to, but we have got some new growth on our Phoenix there. That has definitely come up a little bit. I really must get around to putting new soil. You can see something's burrowing in there too, which won't help. So yeah, so we'll top the soil up a little bit later today, and that should perk us up a bit. The original Malina planting is looks burnt out because of the angle of the sun at the moment, but yeah, pretty healthy growth, pretty vigorous. You can see the little kink where it originally flopped over and then straightened up. This is quite common with anything you plant in sun. Once it's this size, you end up with a slightly wavy line, which means the first coppers of this will not be great for poles, but later coppers should be fine. Number 2, same story, less of a kink because it's a little more sheltered. Number 3, lovely and vigorous growth. Number 4, looking pretty happy too. And number 5. So I am overall pretty happy with that. Okay, now in the middle there, our little sterculia, there is some new growth. And what's come up already is looking nice and healthy. The leaves are much less stressed than they were to begin with. Just folded enough to show off their 5 lobes, really. So yeah, this is our ghost tree. It'll be a long while before the bark starts going white. It has to be a big tree and shed its juvenile bark. But yeah, happy with that. On the Bridelias, 1, 2 less vigorous, 3 really slowing down, but all alive and healthy, so I'm happy with those. For Creosola, showing various degrees of floppiness, they'll all end up straightening up quite well. And if this gets reasonably sheltered, then we should end up with some nice trunking on them too. The aloes from our first round of planting, starting to go nice and green. You can see a lovely little jumping spider just there. There's some flowers coming up and another flower stem already up, so that's pretty good. The Bridelias itself perfectly healthy. Another aloe going green and flowering, and Bridelias looking nice and healthy and with some nice new growth. Same again, a flower coming up on the aloe going green in the middle, and some new growth poking around in the middle of this one. Tamarind's still closing its leaves in heat, but more open than they were last time, which I'm pretty pleased about, so that means it's settling in. These guys may be gaining a little bit of texture, our little speck boom, but nothing much. A little bit of new growth showing nicely on this one, up and down the stem, which is good because I was thinking this one I'd lost already. So second round of Bridelias. A tiny bit of new growth, nothing to write home about really. Same again. This is actually new, so that's to write home about because that's a new leaf, but the subsequent leaf coming up is still tiny. Oh, these are actually both new, I think, so that's good, but this one is less vigorous. You can see the aloes on these ones still much redder, and the Dracaenas still pretty floppy all the way along actually. Stagnating but healthy, so I'm happy enough. A nice little bit of new growth slowly coming up in there. This one again with some nice new growth coming along, so that's pretty good. You can see this more sheltered Dracaena hasn't even flopped yet, and you can see the yellow arborescens going a lot less red than the so-called red Aloe Cameroni. Bridelias CF Aquatica is, yeah, perfectly happy. It might have lost a couple of leaves actually, but it's not an unhappy little tree by any stretch. Once again, this was one that started in a pot, so it's a lot quicker to take. One of the volunteers, not started in a pot, also showing some nice new growth, despite being pretty fresh in, so that's good. Must have been good timing. And the other volunteer from that planting showing a tiny little new growth. I think that leaf might have already been on it, but it's healthy still, which is the important part. And the bamboo is looking nice and green. Has some upward growth actually, I think. Not convinced that's much higher than it was, but it seems a little higher. But definitely pretty vigorous all the way down its stem. Once again, nothing yet from the base. The other bamboo, a little harder to get to. Again, pretty healthy. Some new growth showing up and down. Nothing major, but yeah, certainly some life and vigor in that, so I'm happy. Yeah, that should be all 41, I think. If there's a big red notice on the screen, it'll mean I missed something, and I will edit that in along the way. But I'm pretty happy, especially seeing some new growth coming up on one of the waterberries. That gives me significant comfort that I haven't lost any entire plantings, and seeing the second of the Brachystegias that sat in the ant nest looking reasonably healthy, actually. yeah, I'm not convinced there's any major causes of concern. I really need to top up the soil on that Phoenix, but it itself is actually looking a little better than I expected at this point. So all in all, pretty good.